If we stop and think about some of the research which has already been conducted, while a lot of it's been very good, it's tended to have a narrow focus on issues such as homesickness, transition to school, students' experience of boarding from a historical perspective. It's usually only been conducted in one school or a small number of schools, and usually only across 1 year. Now, most of us would say that boarding has a significant effect, but can we measure these benefits? Are they any different to day students at these schools? Are they different to students who are attending school back home in their home environment? Now, there are many factors, as you well know, that combine to contribute for a successful and happy and engaging time at boarding school. Broadly, we can distinguish between student factors, which might include things like personality, and other contextual factors, for example, peers, the school climate or school ethos, and boarding house leadership, to name a few. Does attending boarding school suit the personality of some young people more than others? Do some personality types act as buffers against some of the challenges of boarding school? What aspects of personality can we emphasise and foster to facilitate the boarding experience? Our key areas for investigation in the proposed study is to look at academic outcomes and non-academic outcomes, things like self-concept, personal development, personality, how people feel about the boarding experience or day experience, and how do these differ for boarders and day students over their time at boarding school. So the aim of the project is to address some key questions. The most important one being, to what extent does the boarding experience play a role in academic and non-academic outcomes? Other subsequent questions, do effects vary as a function of boarding house and boarding school? Do we see a greater difference between boarding houses, or do we see a greater difference between boarding schools? Are there particular stages of school, whether it be junior high school, middle high or senior high school, in which boarding school is particularly influential in shaping the academic and non-academic outcomes? What is the longitudinal profile of academic and non-academic outcomes as students move from year to year in boarding school? Do we see a change over time? What are the real-time experiences of students in boarding school, and how can these inform better practice more broadly? What is the role of boarding school in assisting students beginning a new academic year, essentially looking at transition into boarding school? How do Australian students' responses align with their overseas counterparts? What is the pattern of boarding findings for Indigenous, rural and other understudied groups? And the final question, what is the relative profile of answers to these research questions when we juxtapose them against day students in the same school and the same classroom as the boarding students? We also think that some of our findings may be relevant to other young people in residence living away from home, or who are unable to reside with their parents or caregivers. So in terms of research design, the significant strength of this project is its large-scale pseudo-experimental design. We're proposing to include 20 schools across Australia and 5 in the UK, and that equates to about 15,000 students. So in effect, there are thousands of students being assigned to a treatment group, and that's the boarding experience, and they do that naturally by choosing to come to our boarding schools, and thousands assigned to the day students who self-select into that group as well. And this happens naturally as part of that attendance at those particular schools. So both groups are located in the same school and classrooms, both receive the same instruction from the same teachers, and this offers a very unique situation to make comparisons. So in this project there are 4 key areas of study. The first study is a national and international cross-sectional study, and that's pivotal in this design because most of the students will be situated in the same classrooms and taught by the same teachers, and therefore to a greater extent under the same classroom and school effects. Such a large sample of schools is needed in this study because we need to gain a representation of schools from urban and non-urban areas, from independent or private and government schools, from single-sex and co-ed schools, from Australian and UK schools, and schools with relatively large Indigenous or rural students. And the importance of this study is that it will establish the baseline data for boarders and day students to be compared, and for our comparison a year later in study 2. In terms of academic outcomes, we plan to measure motivation and engagement, academic buoyancy, student approaches to learning, students' perceptions of house and school climate, achievement in the form of school grades and standardised literacy and numeracy assessments, and other achievement-related behaviours. In terms of non-academic outcomes, we plan to measure well-being, for example using the satisfaction with life scale and the positive and negative affect scale, as well as other self-concept scales. Study 2 looks at transitions and causal modelling. It will involve assessing the same students using the same measures a year later. What do we hope this longitudinal approach will give us? We hope to address 2 key issues: transitions and causes. Firstly, in relation to transition, how do any effects, positive or negative, change over time? And secondly, in relation to causal modelling, we pose 2 key questions. Firstly, to what extent do academic and non-academic factors assessed early in the boarding experience predict academic and non-academic outcomes further into the boarding experience? And secondly, what is the nature of these effects compared with day students? Now, identifying causal factors provides very clear and specific direction for educational intervention for boarders and non-boarders alike. And despite the centrality of this question, however, relatively few researchers have pursued it with appropriate longitudinal designs and analyses. Study 3 aims to investigate how the boarding environment influences the academic and non-academic outcomes of individual students. That is, what is the relative contribution of school, house, and student on key academic and non-academic outcomes? Answers to these questions hold substantial implications for our schools in terms of policy and practice. For example, if there is a greater variance in academic and non-academic outcomes between houses than there is between boarding schools, then educational practice and policy must direct attention and resources at the house level, as much or more than at the whole school level. Or, if the bulk of variance that we find in academic and non-academic outcomes resides at the student level, irrespective of house or school that they're in, then practice and policy must adjust to this. Study 4 is our last study, and that uses real-time research. Now, this last study in the proposed project will use cutting-edge research technology and methodology to collect real-time data from students at the start of an academic year and at 2 other key points in high school which are known to demonstrate academic and non-academic challenges. Now, essentially, this is through using personal digital assistants, or PDAs, and sending students key questions that they will need to answer as soon as they get them in their classroom or in their boarding house at specific times throughout the day. Now, just recapping, Study 1 plans to establish a baseline set of data for comparison between boarding and day students. Study 2 plans to establish if and how these students change over time, and are there any causal factors. Study 3 seeks to understand the contextual influence of the boarding environment on students, and Study 4 will provide real-time, day-to-day data on how students cope with academic and non-academic challenges. So this is just a small part of some exciting research being proposed between the Australian Boarding Schools Association and the University of Sydney, and some particularly exciting work that will be conducted by Dr. Andrew Martin and Dr. Paul Gins, the senior investigators on this project. They have some other very interesting material that you might like to read. Now, if you'd like to maintain an interest in this project and find out more along the way, the best thing to do is to have a look at the Lights Out magazine published by the Australian Boarding Schools Association, in which we'll be writing regular articles to update this study. Now, I think there's going to be some very interesting findings from this research. Some good, some challenges, some differences between boarding houses, between boarding schools. But it's the first time that anyone has tried to quantify the effects of boarding, and certainly the first time they've tried to do it to this depth and the breadth that we're proposing. Stay tuned. The results of this project are about 3 to 4 years away. So far, we've had significant interest from Australian schools to be involved. The Boarding Schools Association of UK have come on board in support, and later in the year we'll start recruiting schools once we've confirmed funding for this large project. So if your school's interested in joining this project, please get in touch. Down the track, we hope to develop a simple survey questionnaire that can be administered by schools across Australia and across the globe. So if you're interested in finding out more about this project, please check back with the Australian Boarding Schools Association.